No sound.
All right. Good afternoon. This is Dr. Brent Turvey, unmuted, and I am here with my friend and colleague, Melanie Inglis, a forensic investigator from Canada. This week on The Hard Truth, we're going to talk about ethics in the crime lab. And I know this is not an issue that Melanie has dealt with a lot, but she has dealt with indirectly a lot. That's what I think. In my experience, we both have dealt with it at different levels. I wrote an entire textbook on this subject called Forensic Fraud, and Melanie has dealt with it indirectly through the casework and examinations she's done on behalf of the company that she works with me. So welcome, Melanie. How are you doing? Tell me how you're doing today. I want to know.
I'm fantastic. Are you concerned?
Every day. Every single day.
I am just following along in the pushback from Canada over here with these protests. So that's honestly what I've been doing, and it's quite interesting right now.
What are the protests about? Can you tell our viewers so that they know?
Yeah, not the whole, but a large amount, an actually astonishing amount of truckers have went on full protest, and they're all heading to Parliament to protest all the mandates and everything like that. And it started, there was some rolling protest on the 19th, the 18th and 19th, and the major one started on the 23rd, and it goes all the way through to the 29th. There was just actually an article that came out that approximately 600 US truckers are actually coming to support. So they're coming over in support of the Canadian truckers to drop the mandate. So the videos are incredible. Just for miles, you're just seeing back-to-back transport trucks. So there's concern to that, obviously, because nothing's coming into our grocery stores, right? So there's sacrifice, but somebody's taking a stand, right?
It's always good when people act on their conscience as long as they're not hurting other people. That's kind of my baseline. But when people have legitimate grievances and they do things non-violently, I think that's good. I obviously I am concerned if the people don't have access to stuff. My first thing is always when you go to a store, what's locked up? It tells you exactly what the economy is locally. If you go to Vegas, what's locked up is all the lubricants and the shaving equipment and the perfumes and the colognes, because that's what people use to make money. If you come to other places, say in Latin America, what's locked up is diapers and baby formula.
Yeah.
And so these are the things that people absolutely need and will steal to survive.
Yeah, and in the past couple days since it started, there are lots of pictures surfacing of empty shelves within the grocery stores and things like that already. So all of the truckers are leaving from different parts of cities and provinces and things like that. It's like they're all meeting in one spot. So this is all going to go forward until like the 29th of this month. So that's a long time for nothing to be coming in or going out.
That's a very long time. And my heart goes out to anybody who's having problems getting access to even the basic needs. I know this is difficult for a lot of people. So
it is.
I hope you're doing okay. That's all I can say.
I am. I caught wind of it early. And bought a bunch of freezer food.
There's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Because I mean, when you got kids, you got to take care of them first, right?
That's exactly it. I have 3 other people to feed, right?
That's right. People, not kids. People.
Well, kids, but
But they are people. Kids are people too.
They are people.
So this week we're going to talk about the problem with crime labs and one of the things that has happened over the last. Well, to age me and date me a little bit, I first started getting interested in forensic science in the early 90s, and I got my graduate degree, my Master's of Science in Forensic Science. I completed it in 96. I started in 94, completed it in 96 at the end of 95. At that time, there was a lot of problems, but there was this great optimism in the community where we were leaning towards science. We were leaning towards solutions. We were leaning towards sharing things. But what happened at that time was the O.J. Simpson trial. And because of the video was happening and because crime scene videos were getting introduced into court, and the police were thinking, we're going to professionalize and videotape and document everything, and we're going to have all this great, total stations to do 3D crime scene stuff. We're going to build in that direction. That was the idea, that the police were going to work hand in hand with the crime lab community, and that this would really usher in a new age, a new era of forensic science where technology and science were king, and that law enforcement was fully educated in these areas, and they really wanted to bring all that to bear in a prosecution to make sure the correct people were arrested and prosecuted. What happened in 97 during the O.J. Simpson trial is crime scene videos started to reveal how uneducated, incompetent, negligent, and even biased police officers are at the crime scene with their processing efforts in a very bad way. And then in 1997, my good friend, we were just talking actually about doing a book chapter together on a subject. Basically, Fred Whitehurst is his name. He's a former FBI chemist who was a whistleblower at the FBI lab. And in 1997, his work led to the shutdown of different parts of that lab and an investigation by the Attorney General, by the Office of the Inspector General, demonstrating widespread fraud in the lab, widespread fraud in one way. This is a very important concept. At the FBI crime lab at the time in the 90s, the people that were doing the analysis on the bench in the crime lab, they did not take notes or write reports. What they did was they read everything into a microphone, into a tape, and that tape would be sent to a supervisor. And if they had a finding that said this is absolutely true or this is absolutely not true, or that was undetermined or something, what the supervisor would do is talk to the prosecutors and ask them, what do you want? Softer with our findings or harder with our findings? And then the prosecutor would tell them, and the supervisor would write a report, and it would conform with the needs of the prosecution. The analyst wouldn't even know what happened because their name's not on the report. In fact, what they were doing was submitting reports with no names on them, just supervisors and whatever. So that on the day of testimony, anybody in that unit could go testify and pretend that they were the one who actually did the report. This actually created a huge problem because the examiners didn't know that the supervisor were changing things. The other thing we found out is that the FBI crime lab was being used as a rubber gun squad. Anytime you had an FBI agent who had problems, they put them in the lab. And anytime you had somebody who was a problem in the lab, you take them out of the lab and you put them as an agent in the field. That's why they're all special agents, so they can rotate in and out of these assignments. All right. So they were deceiving people about findings. They were deceiving people about who wrote the reports, and they were providing testimony that violates what we call Crawford or the confrontation clause, which in the United States, in the Constitution guarantees the person who's being accused of a crime of the right to confront their actual accuser in court. And this includes the scientific findings and the person who prepared them, not the person who supervised the person, not the person who was in the room or in the same unit, but the actual person who did the analysis. And that was in the 90s. So we started to have these breaks and cracks in forensic science because it was starting to get more publicized. Do you remember that at all? Or what were you doing at that time? Still, you were younger, obviously.
I was not paying attention to that at that time. No.
I'm sure you weren't. Most people weren't. Only nerds like you were.
Well, and we have an age difference, so.
Oh, that's right. We do. You're a little younger than I am. I'm in my 50s and you are not.
I am not.
Definitely not. So then what happened is Fred Whitehurst, he did whistleblower, and then they did this report and they shut down sections. They said they fixed everything. But in that report, buried in that report, is this culture inside the lab of hiding analysts, of not reporting findings properly. And it also was the case in the hair and fiber section, which I was very well aware of and was screaming about in my reports. But it wasn't until 2015 that those cases actually got reviewed and overturned. And it found out that 29 out of 32 lab analysts at the FBI lab were fabricating their results. They were taking inconclusive results and making them confirmatory. They were citing statistics that didn't exist. They were simply lying. Now, you could say that's only a problem at the FBI lab and their culture, except that in 2012, Washington, D.C. crime lab got shut down because the DNA people were doing the same thing. Every single time there's a DNA crisis at the crime labs, it's because you have people who are not statisticians testifying about matches with DNA using statistics that they don't understand or that are just completely fabricated or they're outdated. All right. So a lot of these, to testify competently on statistical analysis and DNA, you have to be a statistical person. You have to keep current with the current methodology, and you have to have training on the methods that are being used. And you have to have a good database that you fully understand where you're getting your numbers from. And most of them don't. They're just copying what they're being told to do by the rep who sold them the machine. We have
So
most
wait,
of our DNA analysts. What?
you're supposed to continue researching and staying up to date and everything in your position?
Yeah.
Shocking.
So this is the first ethical requirement is whether or not you actually have to be competent at your job. Is it they in 2000 and I think it was before 2012, 2000 maybe in 2009. There's a forensic examiner, a former cop named Rod Englert, who constantly lies about his resume, lies about his findings, does bloodstain pattern analysis, and prosecutors used to love him because he would lie for them all the time. Say one thing in one courtroom, say another thing in another courtroom. He got sued all the time. He was one of the most negligent, incompetent forensic examiners we've ever had, and everybody loved him. And he's still a member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, because when a complaint was made against him, they said, the American Academy of Forensic Science, the president came out and wrote a memo that said, it is not unethical to be ignorant. Let's dissect that a little bit.
Pardon?
And respond to that phrase to me. Is it unethical for a forensic expert to be ignorant?
I would say yes. It would be unethical to be ignorant in that position.
Tell me why. Why would you think, just as a regular person who's just encountering this notion for the first time, why would you think that's true?
A few reasons. One being this affects somebody's life. You're making things up that's going to directly affect somebody's life or a family's life or something like that, and you're just lying your way through it and presenting it as fact.
Well, you're presenting your opinion. First, you're presenting yourself as an expert, which you're not. Okay. Second, you're presenting your opinion as informed and competent, which it can't be because, again, you're ignorant. So you're doing two things wrong. One, presenting yourself as an expert, which you're not, and two, presenting your findings as though they're scientifically reliable when they're not. And you're not doing it one time, you're doing it every time. And the third thing you're doing is you're not taking the information from your professional community and getting better. You're not staying current with the best scientific literature and best practices. You're just doing what the prosecution wants. So that's the first thing. The first level has to be of ethical requirement has to be, you have to be knowledgeable. You cannot put yourself forward as an expert unless you actually have expert credentials. All right. So if you're a person who's a professor of history, this does not make you an expert in bloodstain pattern analysis. There was a forensic examiner for a behavioral scientist who worked for we'll call him that. That's not what he was. A cop who is a guy named Greg McCrary, worked for the profiling unit for the FBI for a long time. And we finally, after years destroying his credibility in court, finally got him, after he retired, removed from all cases. He no longer works cases. Thank goodness. In Georgia, for example, he was not allowed to be admissible as an expert because he'd been struck down so many times for lying about his resume. McCrary, in one of the cases he worked on that I worked on the other side of, he claimed that he was an expert. As an FBI agent, he's an expert in crime. Therefore, all areas of crime, including every single type of crime, every single type of evidence interpretation, even though he had no education, training, or experience in these areas. Now, what was his actual education? He would come into court and say, I have a master's of science in psychology. Well, that's interesting. Or no, MA, a master of arts in psychology. He claimed he got it from Marymount University. At the time, Marymount University did not have a master's degree in psychology. They didn't even have a psychology school. They had a school of education. And his degree, he listed it as an MA in psychology, was actually an MA in psychological services, which means he was qualified to be a guidance counselor.
Right, a guidance.
No clinical time, no time understanding behavioral issues or behavioral science issues, completely negligent. Marymount University actually hired him to teach classes on forensic psychology, which was amazing because he was in the FBI. So what was an undergrad? So let's forgive that and say maybe he has an undergraduate degree that's relevant. His undergraduate degree was in music. So if you have your degree in music and your graduate degree is in guidance counseling, and you're putting yourself forward as an expert in behavioral science and forensic science, how is that possible? Because of your title as an FBI agent working for the Behavioral Sciences Unit. So this cover that's provided by the state to incompetent, negligent examiners is the first part of the problem. So for me, what I'm telling you is the first issue is you have to have an education, training, and experience in your area, in the area that you are putting yourself forward in. A music teacher or a music graduate cannot put themselves forward as an expert in forensic science. You need additional credentials. Does that make sense? Respond to that to me, if you will, because I think it's a fascinating issue to me.
But it is fascinating. What I was going to ask is, is it because they are siding with the prosecution or with the state at that point, that they keep this going on for so long, like they keep hiding it for so long because they have them in favor of them, right? So the prosecution gets what they want from this particular person, so they keep hiding all of these credentials. Is that why it goes on for so long? Like in my head, I'm thinking, how can you get that position with that resume?
Because nobody checks the resume. You start out, and by the way, McCurry was never a cop either, so he didn't have that. He just joined the FBI. So if you have a credential that says police on it, law enforcement of any kind, it is not possible for anyone in that community to attack you. You have blanket immunity from your own culture for being reviewed, because the culture does not want to be reviewed. So many people are doing dirt and doing bad things. They don't question other people because they don't want to be questioned themselves. That's the first part of it. But the second part is, and I was having this conversation with Aurelio right before this started, for our podcast started, and that is, I asked him directly, I said, because we're dealing with these issues. We're dealing with issues of police officers lying about evidence, withholding evidence, going into court and acting like they're experts in areas where they're not. Because what the trend right now is this: prosecutors are not calling forensic scientists to talk about the physical evidence. They don't want to do that. They're not calling forensic scientists. They're calling police officers to testify about what the forensic science means to them. And they're backdooring. They're saying, oh, he's an expert, kind of, so he's relying upon these other reports, and he's going to explain what they mean. In courts around the country, police officers and prosecutors are substituting for forensic scientists, and the defense community is doing nothing. The defense community is rolling over, very often because they want a job with the prosecutor's office, or because they're friends with the people in the prosecutor's office, or because they're married to prosecutors and police officers. So they don't want to rock their own boat. So this is the question. Why are they not checking? Why are they participating in this level? If they are not qualified to do the work, why are they doing it? It's because they're getting the job, and that organization, that institution, whether it's the Attorney General's office, prosecutor's office, police department, they are alienating this person from the real professional requirements and creating their own institutional requirements that are completely separate from good scientific practice. So the notion that a crime lab represents best scientific practice or a group of scientists is completely false. This is the actual finding of the NAS report, the National Academy of Sciences report, published in 2009, and the PCAST report, the President's Commission on Science, that was the reviewed forensic science in 2016 under Obama, found the same thing. Law enforcement and forensic science are completely connected in a way that is totally inappropriate and that violates basic ethical requirements for good scientific practice, because they have separate missions. Law enforcement operates with handguns, handcuffs, and interrogations. Forensic scientists are supposed to be scientific, objective, and separate, and removed from that so that they're doing independent, objective analysis. And they're not. So my question was even more deliberate than that. My question was horrible. I asked Aurelio, I said, what do you think? Do you think it's because they're evil or they're just stupid? He said it's because when they get hired in, and I don't disagree with him, when they get hired into these jobs, they are alienated from their professional selves and from real professional scientific practice by their institution. So they don't even know what it is, and they're not rewarded for exploring outside of it. The way you learn this is by looking at their training. Their training is completely in-house. They don't get training from actual scientific experts. They don't bring in people who are competent, knowledgeable in best scientific practice. They bring in other cops. Forensic scientists are very often trained by who? Prosecutors and other police officers. They're not trained by scientists. They're not trained by actual people with objective understanding of the best scientific practice. And in fact, they're actually told, do not read the NIS report. Do not read the PCAST report. Do not use this book. Do not use that book. These are the protocols and mandates for you, and you're going to answer this way. And one of the things that's happened over the years, and I want you to respond to this, because, well, first of all, tell me, when you read a crime lab report, how easy is it to read it and understand what it means to you? I mean, you're not a layperson. You have some expertise and some experience, but you've read a lot of forensic reports, ballistic reports, DNA reports, sexual assault nurse examiner's reports. So the threshold is, one, let's presume now we have a competent scientist. We don't. That's the first ethical requirement, be competent. Second ethical requirement is that you need to use best scientific practice. That's not happening. The third one is report your findings objectively and fairly and intelligently. Tell me your experience reading these reports as a person who's just been doing it for a couple of years now.
Well, it depends on the report, but for the most part, I would say that it's very unorganized. There's a lot of information that's missing, and they use a lot of verbiage sometimes to just cover up some issues because they haven't done something or they're trying to hide something. So it depends on, I find, who's writing the report, but they all seem very similar and they're not done very well. And I'm still learning. I'm just at the very beginning of this, and I'm seeing that this isn't done properly. And these are people in positions that are supposed to have a lot more education and training and experience than I do, and I can see that problem.
Yeah. So let me give you an example. Last year or 2 years ago, I was working on a case in Kansas. The Ron Torres, Washington case. And in that case, there was some DNA evidence that was found. And the DNA report was written. And the defense attorney contacted me about it. And they're like, oh my God, we got DNA that includes our client at the scene and is causing problems. And I'm like, okay, I'm looking at the case. I'll do a reconstruction with everything. And I'll look at those results and talk to you about it. I called him back within like 2 hours after reading the DNA report. The DNA report makes it very clear, if you know how to read it, that the defendant was actually excluded, that there are other people. But it's written in such a way by the examiners to make you believe that it's possible that the guy's included. And so they don't, and they have their own standards for reporting. It's supposed to be inclusion, exclusion, undetermined. And even at the preliminary hearing, the DNA analyst testified that way, but those words were nowhere in her report. Why? Because she was doing it in such a way to allow the prosecutor to argue however they wanted in court, to frighten the defense, who didn't understand what they were reading, into thinking there was an inclusion when there wasn't.
You know what? There's one other thing that I've seen a few times that, like I said, I'm just at the beginning of everything, and I reached out to you immediately because I said, how is this possible? How are we at this point? So somebody's already been charged. We're dealing with someone who's already in prison. We're going back over these reports, and in the DNA, it was I think it was blood. It wasn't hair. I think we're dealing with blood at that point. But all of the examples, so they took a swab from here, and then they give you the example, like it's a match to this DNA profile, or it's not a match, or it's a full match, or how, all of these things. And the person that has been incarcerated for this crime on the entire report said, not a match to this person. This is not a match. This is not a match. And I'm going through like, how is this person here when it is saying right in the report that there is no match to this person? So how did we get here?
Two things. One, you have the complete and implicit, the complete bias of law enforcement and how they conduct their investigations. They get enough to meet the basic requirements to make an arrest. They make the arrest and they're done. Their hands, we're out.
That's it.
Then the prosecution comes along and they don't read the file, nor do they even maybe understand it. They assume that the law enforcement did their job. So they're going to read the file maybe 3 weeks before the crime, before the trial.
Or the trial.
So before the trial. This is so negligent. There's 3 areas of negligence. One, law enforcement being rewarded for making arrests that clear cases and don't find the truth. Because you can arrest somebody and have them sitting in jail, and then you think, well, I'm going to arrest them, then I'm going to build a case. That's completely unethical. It's legal, but it's unethical. So that's the first part. Law enforcement arresting people based on the very minor legal threshold without doing an investigation because they know they're not going to be rewarded for it. The second thing is prosecutors not reading the case and then being humiliated by the fact they haven't read the case. So now they're stuck with this thing where this guy's been in prison. They can't admit they didn't read the case. So now they got to find a way to make this guy guilty too. Then the third prong is defense attorneys. Lazy as hell half the time, or more than half the time. They're not reading the file. They're not reading they're doing the same thing the prosecutors are doing. They got too many cases. They're not reading their files. They're not reading the evidence. And what they do read is equivocal or they don't understand it. And it's not until an actual forensic professional gets involved and educates either side. The prosecution has a greater burden because their job is to know the case backwards and forwards and not suborn perjury and not put people in jail that are innocent, that kind of stuff. But they're not including forensic scientists in their debate. They're not including their forensic scientists in their discussion. They want to talk to the police because their whole identity, their whole professional persona is now wrapped up. Their ego is wrapped up in this arrest and they need to convict this person. So what they're hoping is they can make a couple offers and that the defense will not have read the file and they'll just deal. They'll just make a deal. So a lot of these cases a deal gets made before we go to trial. Let me give you an example right now. I got a case in California where I just finished the report on it this weekend. And Diana, who's sitting behind me, helped me with it. She was tremendous help. This case involves a shooting, and it involves one 9mm cartridge and a bunch of 40 caliber cartridges. And it's very clear if you do the reconstruction what happened. But let me tell you what the prosecution argued. The prosecution is arguing that, well, we need it to only be one shooter. We need this guy not to be in a shootout. So therefore, we're going to argue that it's the same gun that can shoot a 40 caliber round and a 9mm round just by swapping out the barrels. That's their theory. There's no forensic science report backing this up. There's no legitimate scientific mechanism by which this is possible without changing out the barrels during the gunfight, at the scene for no reason. And there's no legitimate reason that this would even make sense in the context of the crime. But it's a theory they think is possible. So they're floating the theory to the defense to try to get them to make a deal. They're like, we can prove it. No, you can't. You have no forensic scientist saying this. It's just the prosecutor in the dark by himself, not talking to anyone, watching a lot of TV, being stupid, and promoting a theory that does not make any sense. If they talk to an actual forensic scientist, they would not promote this theory. But you should not be speaking in an area where you don't know, where you don't understand it. And one of those areas is forensic science. Now, when a lawyer is talking about forensic science, it's time to stop listening because they're not an expert. They don't know about it, and they're only making arguments. First thing that we did is we examined all the evidence that they were trying to use to suggest this is possible. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. But guess what? Just because it's possible doesn't mean it happens. So let's take a look and see what we need to have evidence of. The first thing, we eliminated this theory rapidly. How? By looking at the firing pin marks. In one firing pin for the 9mm, it's round. The firing pin hitting the faceplate is round. And in the other 40 caliber ammunition, the faceplate is consistent with a Glock and it's square. So if you just look at the shell casings and the strike marks that are on it, you know it's two different guns. Unless you're arguing that he changed the actual physical composition of the pistol. But this is the kind of thing that happens when you have attorneys operating without forensic science and without good forensic experts to evaluate their theories. They just put things out there. And if people lack the knowledge to defeat them, they won't do it. It's true with DNA. It's true with firearms and tool marks. It's true with behavioral science and psychology. It's true across the board. So this issue of having prosecutors interpret the physical evidence with the assistance of police to create theories without criticism, evaluation, or questioning by legitimate scientific examiners is, I believe, the problem. And it's being done on purpose. It's not an accident. This is designed entirely to facilitate the bullying that many prosecutors engage in to try to get defense attorneys who aren't reading their files to settle cases without examining them. Does that help?
Yeah, what I was going to ask is that without calling someone like you in, with these cases are just going to be settled, or they're going to make a deal with that right away before trial, wouldn't they? In most cases, they wouldn't even try to theorize whatever that prosecutor's saying about the barrels of the guns or anything. They would just be like, okay, if you can prove it, let's make a deal. Is that normally what would happen? They wouldn't bring in forensic scientists.
Yeah, if you what I always see as a red flag is when a prosecutor or a police officer promotes a theory that they haven't checked with a forensic scientist. Because if you really value the truth and your own integrity and competency, before you think about making an arrest or before you think about making an accusation, you want to see if there's evidence that you can test your theory against. Unfortunately, it's faster and easier to manipulate the statements of witnesses. That's what we're finding. Right. So they're not interested in forensic science at all because it's too firm. It's too unmovable.
Mm-hmm.
I lost you there. Does that make sense? They're not interested.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They're not interested. So the first thing for a person working in a crime lab is, one, they have an obligation to be competent and to maintain their competency by getting continuous education and training in their area. Two, to use best scientific practice when they're doing their examinations. One of the things we do is, and I know that you do it, is that when we're looking at a case and there's an issue you may be unfamiliar with, or an issue that is important, you do some research. You just do some research and find out what's the best current scientific practice for interpreting gunshot residue or interpreting DNA or this particular type of, we just were working on a case where it was a particular field test that's being used for determining whether drugs exist, right? Or in another case we're working on where they have it's the testing that's being the kits that are being used by medical examiners to determine whether or not somebody has drugs in their urine at the autopsy. What's the error rate of this kit? So you look these things up.
Right.
Legitimate forensic practitioners are accustomed to doing research to make sure that they understand the state of the art in every case. In every case, they do a little research to figure out whether or not the best practices are being used by the people who have done some of the work and to make sure they're using best practices. So education, best scientific practices, continuous education and training. And then finally, clarity of reporting. Clarity in your reporting, so you will report your limitations. This is the problem, is that if you are very clear in your reporting, it means the prosecutor can't use you. So what's going to happen is they're going to use a cop, and they're going to avoid the physical evidence. So a red flag for me is when we don't have the forensic scientists involved at all, or when they're being I worked a case in Oregon where a bunch of evidence was collected in this rape case. And basically I said, look at all the physical evidence that can prove the prosecution's correct or incorrect is right here. We just need to test it. And they refused to test it. In fact, they were fighting tooth and nail to not test it. And it was because it absolutely exonerated the defendant, right?
Right.
So I was in a hearing about this, and the judge said, you can't testify about this. I'm like, why? It's best scientific practice. And he goes, because I've been thinking long and hard about this. And what I realized is the police are not required to do a perfect or Cadillac or competent investigation in every case. They're just not required to do it. And I said, so they can collect evidence to create the illusion they're doing something, but they're not required to test it? And he goes, exactly. And I said, so, Your Honor, I have no problem with that as long as you explain it to the jury exactly like that in those words. And he got so mad with me. He was furious. The client, eventually the client was exonerated across the board in this was the Driscoll case in Oregon out of Deschutes County. But it was just the jury lined up to hug the guy because they felt so bad at the lies that the complainant had made and what the judge did to keep out the evidence. And so that's the third level, is the crime lab can't do this without the collusion of other people in the justice system, including defense attorneys, prosecutors, and judges. So it's very frustrating for me. I see this on a regular basis. And to me, if you are working, I'm going to say it another way. This is a terrible thing for me to say, but I want to say it out loud because it has to be said. Nobody aspires to work for the state crime lab. That's where you start. It is not where you finish. And if you are still working there after many, many years, it is to me an indication that you can't go private, either because you need the benefits, the steady income and the benefits, or because you lack the competency to do so, or you lack the background, like you couldn't be challenged. Like for me, I have to keep my nose clean. I have to behave ethically, competently, and legally. I can't break the law. Anything that I do is on the table for discussion about my character, because that's what they use to attack me. In fact, if I go to court, we'll spend 6 hours, 4 to 6 hours talking about me, and maybe 1 hour or 2 hours talking about my report, maybe less, because they can't attack the science in my report. They can only attack me. But if you work for the state and you try to have your credential, and they try to attack your credentials, 9 times out of 10, the judge will protect the analyst from the state. They will not. Most forensic scientists that I know who work for the state have never suffered a real, actual cross-examination until I get involved in a case or someone like me does, and we prepare real cross-examination questions for them. We're asking them things like basic questions. And this goes to the next thing. If you want to show your basic competent scientific proficiency, the question is this: what's the scientific method? Please describe that. You're a scientist. What's the scientific method? And invariably, the response we get is, oh, there are lots of scientific methods. It's every case is different. No, there aren't. There's only one scientific method, and it's universal. Well, that's not true in this state, or that's not true in this country, or that's not true. No, it's true around the world. There's one scientific method. Everybody uses it. And if you didn't use it, you can't call your results scientific. The scientific method is an approach to thinking in case evaluation and evidence examination and theory testing that is universal, but they don't know it. Like I had one scientist who was like a 30-year veteran. He was on the stand, and we asked him what the scientific method was. He goes, I'm not really sure. I really haven't heard about it since I was in the 8th grade. So they're admitting that they don't know what it is. Because the next question is, what's the scientific method? Now that you've described it, how did you apply it in this case? And if they didn't, then they can't. If they can't articulate it and don't understand it, then they can't say that the results are scientific.
No.
It's very easy to do. Shockingly, horrifyingly easy. And that's what I wanted to ask you. When you hear stuff like that, how do you, as a newcomer to the forensic endeavor, how does that make you feel? I mean, we talked about this with police before. When we're dealing with forensic scientists, these are the lab coat guys. How does that make you? How do you respond to that?
I am absolutely horrified by the things that I'm seeing and reading. And the article that you sent previous to this, I don't know if you're going to share that article.
Oh yeah, I will. Let's do it now. Go ahead.
That was something like the severity of what this means. I think I understood it, but I think a lot of people aren't really dissecting it. When you're dealing with, you said if it's one crime lab, but it's not. It's everywhere. Yeah. And these are hundreds, sometimes thousands of cases that should and have been reopened now because of this behavior. This is very impactful. And I don't think that I was quite aware of the severity of how many actual cases there were that had this, because in this article too, it talks about the bad apple, right? Maybe one or two, or a bad person that does it here or there, and it's limited to a certain, like a minimal amount of cases. This is not. This is horrific to me.
All right, so this is a Brandon Garrett, who works for the Innocence Project, or used to work for the Innocence Project. He wrote a book that's very similar to my book that was written in my book was published in 2013. This was published in 2021. It's on essentially the crime lab crisis in the United States. What it does is it talks about the problems with the Washington, D.C. crime lab, which was like a $220 million crime lab, state of the art, all this great stuff. Basically, they keep trying to argue, it's all just bad apples doing bad things, making wrongful interpretations. And the issue, and most recently, the recent experience of the D.C. Department of Forensic Science, in case in point, the DCF lost its accreditation. It lost the crime lab. The DFS crime lab for Washington, D.C. lost its accreditation because it engaged in, quote, misrepresentations and fraudulent behavior, unquote, in connection with inconsistent results in a series of firearms examinations. Now, people can go look this up if they want, but what I want to say is this is where it happens. They have inconsistent results, and then they present them as conclusive in court. Mm-hmm. And this happens a lot. And they don't have good statistics, so they just make them up. That's right now. 10 years ago, the crime lab got shut down at the same time, and the director fired because they were misstating statistical results and probabilities in their DNA results. This crime lab is not new to the problem of fraud or misrepresentation. And it's not one analyst, it's all of them in a particular unit. Now it's firearms and tool marks. Before it was DNA. This is one lab that handles thousands of cases a year. One lab. And this problem exists in every single lab that is audited. It is not a problem that is new or different. So you cannot argue that it's a bad apple. You have to understand that it's cultural. The problems with forensic science are cultural. When you have law enforcement or prosecutors in charge of the crime lab, it prevents them from hiring qualified people. It prevents them from being free to educate themselves and get knowledgeable and stay current with the best scientific practices. And it rewards them or induces them or coerces them into distorting their findings in written form in such a way that you can interpret it multiple ways to allow for the prosecutor to do whatever the hell they want. To me, it is unconscionable for there to be a police officer or a law enforcement officer or a group or a state agency that's associated with law enforcement to have any oversight or influence into a crime lab. It's just plain wrong. It is against good scientific practice. And that's the ethical requirement. I'll remember what Aurelio said one time. We were talking to this, I think we mentioned it before. We were talking to this group of people about bad practice of police torture. We were talking about that last weekend. Mm-hmm. The guy's like, well, we have to do it. I mean, if we don't do it, what are we supposed to do when we see it and we work for this agency? I mean, what are we supposed to do? And Aurelio's like, quit. If your agency is doing doing bad things, and you're not saying anything, even if you're not participating in that, you need to get out of there because you're promoting it. You're accepting it. You are endorsing it by merely existing and saying nothing.
Part of the problem.
In inaction. And not speaking up, not documenting, your inaction, your failure to act is a form of negligence, and it's a form of approval. Failure to act is an action. Failure to protect society and the public from this kind of misconduct is an action. It's a choice you're making. And I can't be, what I hate is when I hear forensic scientists act, well, that's not my job. I just do my analysis and then the lawyers do what they want. No, my friend. Your job is to make sure you write a report that cannot be abused. One of the things I'm dealing with right now are attorneys who are, defense attorneys even, who are colluding with prosecutors so that they can make a plea deals or they can keep their friendships. And they are asking me to leave things out of reports. Don't talk about that.
Wow.
That's already been, legally, I don't want you to talk about that. Don't bring this issue up. Just leave that out. Or this issue has already been litigated. And what I always say is I don't care about the legal parts of it. I care about the scientific parts. I'm not here to advise you on the law and what's legal. I'm here to tell you I don't care what the legal ramifications are. The scientific requirement is that I look at this evidence, consider this evidence, and consider the reliability of this evidence and use these protocols. And if you're asking me to violate best scientific practice, of course, you're not going to be in trouble for that. It doesn't cost you anything. It costs me.
Right.
Later on, I'll be held account for that because I'll be the one to understand. And that's the other thing. When you put your name on a report that deliberately deceives or suppresses evidence, you are engaging in fraud. Is that a concept that's too difficult to understand? Or what do you think? Do you think I'm being too difficult? Tell me.
No, that is not a difficult concept to understand either.
Right.
It sometimes baffles my mind that this is going on up until your level, like into forensic science.
Yep.
There's names on reports, things are left out, people are hiding stuff. I don't know. Every time I look at a case, I think I'm shocked. It's starting to wear off a little bit because I'm seeing it all of the time. But it was a huge transition in mindsets to see what's actually going on in the severity of these issues.
Yeah, we're working on a case right now, Diane and I, and it involves a medical examiner's interpretation of bullet trajectory through the body. And in his notes, he says it kind of okay, but leaves some stuff out. And in his report, he just completely gets it wrong, just completely gets the sequence wrong and puts it in his report as though it's okay to do that. And I recall back in the old days, back in the 90s, when I was reading for autopsy reports, and they would include evaluations of whether or not wounds were pre-mortem, post-mortem, or ante-mortem. They would include shooting incident trajectory analysis. They would include really clear toxicological analysis. It would be very clear whether or not something was related to the cause and manner of death. And now prosecutors have interfered with medical examiners to the point where medical examiners are frightened little people now. They're just frightened little professionals who can't write real reports. And it's pathetic to me. I see a medical examiner and I wonder, do you have the actual professional acumen and courage to actually write the truth in your report or no? Oh, what does Valeria said? Also, professionals should not put in the position to choose between what they want to keep their job and do. This is very good. The forensic professionals, Valeria, you're absolutely right, should be free to make their findings without fear that they will be terminated or sanctioned politically. They should be free to do that, and they're not. When they work for the state, they're not free. They feel the pressure constantly. They feel the pressure to withhold. They feel the pressure to collude, to be collegial, and to help the prosecution instead of render their findings in accordance with best scientific practice. What I'm always surprised by is prosecutors and other attorneys who think that I'm being uncollegial when I give them as I say, here's the scientific practice, here's what's required, and here's what I found. And they're like, well, that's not, you can't say that. I'm like, yeah, I can. I'm a scientist. I can say what I want. Well, but you're not allowed to do that. I'm like, you know what, counselor, I don't work for you. I don't work for you. I work for the justice system. And in the context of that work, you can't fire me. You can only disagree with me and bring on somebody else. And when I get an attorney who's disagreeing with me, I say, well, I'm sure that if I am wrong and my methods are incompetent, the jury will be happy to hear from your expert and what they say. Because if you are right, you will be putting on an expert to say that these protocols don't exist and this finding is illegitimate. I am sure that will happen. And when it doesn't happen, then we'll know the answer. And invariably, it doesn't happen because they can't.
Doesn't happen.
That's the thing. They should be. Forensic scientists have a right, I think, to exist in the justice system without fear of attacks or reprisal or losing their state job. And that's why I think it's so bad to have police and prosecutors to have any influence on that at all, because their interests are completely political. The scientific endeavor must be separate from the political endeavor. That doesn't mean that political issues don't interfere or don't impact. They do. Human rights issues absolutely impact. We have that's the other ethical requirement I want to get to, because I've written about this quite a bit. And that is that let's talk about the forensic scientist's responsibility with respect to human rights, because I want to close with that. I think this is one of the most powerful issues that I've encountered in my career in the last 10 years. And I've been working on this with Dr. Coronado, with Aurelio, for the last 8. Aurelio and I have been working together now for 8 years. And we finally have come to a place where we understand how the language of human rights applies to forensic science. And this is how it works. In the constitution of and I put this now in my reports, by the way. I put this in my reports because it's so tremendously important. Every single criminal defendant has a right to due process in the Constitution of not only the United States, but in state constitutions, right? That's the first thing. But also, so does every victim. Every victim has a right to due process. Due process requires a competent investigation into the facts and evidence. So they have the civil and human right to competent investigations. The only way to ensure that a competent investigation is happening is if forensic scientists engage in due diligence. When a forensic scientist does not engage in due diligence, due process is violated. So to pretend that a forensic science examiner or even a forensic investigator, such as yourself, has nothing to do with human rights or civil rights, it is a complete fabrication by your employer to prevent you from speaking up on these issues. So I put it now into every report. I'm going to what I'm doing is to comport with the requirements of due process by engaging in due diligence. Due diligence means exactly what we talked about. Making sure that you're competent, you're properly educated and trained, and that you're using the best scientific practice for the moment. That you understand the literature, that you understand your obligation to be competent, not negligent, and that you have an obligation to report your findings accurately and reliably. If you're not doing those things, you are violating the rights of both the defendant and the victim. Respond to that real quick, because I put that now in every report, because I'm always being asked about why, this is not a thing. I'm like, it absolutely is a thing. And if you don't understand that, it's because your employer is alienating you from your profession so they can manipulate you and exploit you. Tell me what you think.
Right. And they don't want that to be a thing, because then that puts more pressure on them doing their job. Also,
right. If you do your thing,
right?
Then they got to actually do their job. They actually got to work.
Exactly. Everything can just kind of be shoved to the side as it has been. But when you bring that into the casework and into your reports, then something has to be done. There has to be an awareness of that.
Not just an awareness, an attendance. You have to be aware of it.
Yeah.
And you got to do it.
And do it. And they don't want to do that.
What I keep finding is forensic scientists who work for the state who don't understand their responsibility to human rights, let alone civil rights. Great way to get sued, by the way. Great way for you to wind up getting sued. What's happened in the last 10 years is now forensic experts have actually gotten sued by criminal defendants who've been wrongfully convicted because of their involvement. I'll give you a great case that everybody knows about. Everyone remembers the Duke lacrosse case, I hope, in the United States. Duke lacrosse case was the lacrosse team at Duke University was accused unilaterally by one young lady, a woman named Crystal Gail Magnum. That was her stage name. But she was a dancer who was brought to there with one of her friends to dance and engage in acts of sex acts for money with the Duke lacrosse team. She accused them of rape. And there was forensic testing done of DNA. And when they went to preliminary hearings into trial, they presented the DNA as though it included the Duke lacrosse players. It didn't. The prosecutor in that case, Mike Nifong, he did not use the state crime lab in North Carolina to do these analysis. He went to a private lab where the guy who worked there, he controlled him. He controlled the guy because the people at the state crime lab, they weren't listening to him. They have their accreditation, they're doing their thing, and they're ignoring him. So he goes to a private lab with a guy he knows that he can control, and that guy makes a report that leaves out a bunch of stuff, including the fact that all the DNA that's in her matches other people. Doesn't match anybody at Duke in the Duke lacrosse team. So he engaged in he solicited a fraudulent forensic report, and the forensic scientist who did it participated as well. All right. So they wind up going to trial, and the defense attorneys in the case, they used my textbook, Rape Investigation Handbook, to actually prepare their defense and actually help investigate the case and tear down the state's arguments and that kind of stuff. And they wind up getting all these guys exonerated. And what did they do? This was Williams and Connolly is the law firm, and I've worked for them on a number of cases since then. That's how I know they used my book, because they used my book. Then they decided to start using me for other cases. Williams and Connolly is one of the top law firms in the nation. Like one of the top of the top three, I would say they're the number one. They represent presidents, and they get people acquitted. They do not get people convicted. The only president they have not represented in the last 30 years is Trump. They refuse to represent him because, he's guilty. So that's not going to work. And plus the PR there would be nightmarish, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Anyway, and plus Trump also doesn't pay his bills. So that's the other problem. They're expensive. What they do is they do the criminal part. And then the second thing they do is they go and they civilly hold accountable every single forensic and investigative and legal professional who was involved in the prosecution. And they sued. They went after Mike Nifong, who went to jail. One of the first times a prosecutor ever went to jail for hiding evidence and collaborating with a forensic scientist to create false evidence and false reports. And they went after the forensic scientist, who was the DNA guy, and they sued him for everything. And he is now penniless and unemployed, as it should be, frankly, for what he did. Right. My point is, if you do not understand your responsibility to civil rights and to human rights as a forensic examiner, your ethical responsibility, you are open to legal liability. Now, I shouldn't need to say that, because the first thing I need to say is it's fucking wrong to lie. That's the thing we're skirting around, right? It's fucking wrong to lie and misrepresent your credentials, to misrepresent your knowledge of the state of the art of science, and to misrepresent your findings. It's fucking wrong. But if that's not enough for you, maybe you need to understand that you can get sued.
Right.
Into a hole. Tell me about that. Tell me about your thoughts about, in terms of the forensic scientist's responsibility to tell the truth and to understand human rights. Because I don't think that's a conversation we're having enough. How has that impacted you as a professional?
Well, what I was going to say is, until we started talking and I was going through your courses and then we started working cases together, I had never even heard that. Like, that was not something that is talked about very often, the human rights perspective in casework. So that was something that I'm still just learning about it, but it seems so obvious. It seems obvious. Don't lie. Like, it seems so obvious, yet it's not. And there's so much that goes into what they're hiding and why they're hiding it and all of these sorts of things. So every time I'm looking at it, it's like brand new information to me, even though it seems like it should just be what's happening.
But also, it's not just about it's about understanding what a lie is. A lie is not only an act of saying something that's true or something that's false. A lie involves saying something that's not true, right?
Right.
But this includes half-truths. It includes wrapping something that's a complete lie in a bunch of true things, or it includes remaining silent when someone is lying on your behalf, or lying if you're part of a team and they're lying and they're misrepresenting the case and you know it and you're not saying anything. You're allowing a lie to continue. Your inaction is action, is approval. Yeah. Your inaction against the lies of other people is approval of their lies, and thereby your endorsement of lying.
I think there's so much fear involved around this topic that we're talking about for these professionals, and then there was no consequence for a long time. But like you just said, when they sued, that was well deserved, and these are the things that should be happening, in my opinion.
When you say fear, talk a little bit about that before we wrap up. Talk about the fear that you sense from the community about this stuff, because I have a very specific sense of it, but I want to know what you think.
There's the fear of losing their job or not being hired or going to prison for things that also lies. Things can turn on you as quickly as they're for you, right? In this sort of industry, if you're not following suit with what you're being told. There's a lot of pressure I sense in the area, specifically with the prosecution and medical examiners. I've noticed that the fear in that specific area, because just by the reports that I read, some of them are very well done and very descriptive, and then I'll get one that's like a paragraph, and I can get a sense that they're being pressured because of that, right? And they're leaving these things out. But then you have to worry about your career on two aspects: either you follow suit and you lie about it, so you could lose your job, or you leave the information out and you're caught and lose your job, or worse, right?
So the fear of losing your job, the fear of losing your, in a small sense, then the fear of losing your place in the professional community. But there's also a third thing, which is, I think people need to acknowledge this. It's the fear of losing their community. They hyper identify with the law enforcement community.
Right.
And they believe they're on a mission to get bad guys. And this prevents them from being honest about the corruption that they're seeing right in front of themselves, or that they're participating in by leaving things out. And I have made a decision in the last few years now, because I'm getting pressured so much, even by defense attorneys who are colluding with the prosecutors inappropriately, that I am no longer going to do that. I'm no longer going to ask permission. I'm no longer going to participate in that way. I'm going to say, here's my findings. And I don't care if you don't like that they're in there. I don't care if you've already litigated this issue. It's going in my report, because I'm not going to be the guy that left it out.
As it should.
And you got to have a certain position and confidence in yourself as a professional. And then you have to have a certain level of security to do that. And that's what Valeria was talking about. We should start calling it what it is: the forensic insecurity. We have a bunch of forensic insecurity that creates cowardice. Forensic insecurity leads to scientific cowardice. And your ethical responsibility is to be beyond that. If you can't be beyond that, if you can't rise above that and be a good scientific professional and engage in best practices, you probably have no reason to be in this community. You have no place in this community other than to participate, other than essentially endorsing corruption and endorsing bad practice. And that's where I'll leave it. For me, that's the thing, is having the ethical character to actually act on your ethical obligations, to investigate them, to understand them, and act on them. And if you're doing nothing and allowing things that are bad going on around you, then you're part of the problem. Well, I want to give you the last word.
I liked your point about confidence as well. That's something I'm learning as I'm going through this, that you have to build that confidence, because at that point where you go to trial, you said they talked for 6 hours about you trying to tear down your credibility. You have to, it's part of this industry as you're starting. You have to learn everything you need to learn. You need to be researching and doing all that while building an unbreakable confidence, because there is pressure at every angle for everything that you write.
Right. And you feel, even when you don't feel it, you feel it. I actually have to stop on that. So thank you for that. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate your perspective on these things. And I love the journey that you're on in terms of starting out with this information and responding to it, reacting to it, like without the bias and interference of a law enforcement get the bad guys mindset. You're more about the science and getting to the truth and finding out what happened. That, to me, that's commendable. I hope it lasts. For me too, by the way.
Yeah.
I hope it lasts for me too. All right, we're going to leave it there. This podcast will be available on Spotify and YouTube and everywhere else the podcasts are available. This has been The Hard Truth.